In this short discussion, we will discuss guidance documents and the relationship to the Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR. Now, admittedly, to most, this is a pretty boring subject, but like all subjects in regulatory affairs, it does not have to be boring. It matters simply on how you approach the topic. Unfortunately, many people approach most topics in regulatory affairs in a very boring fashion. But this will be, hopefully, an exception to that rule. So let's talk a little bit about guidance documents. What is a guidance document? A guidance document is nothing more than commentary, as I like to call it, on the Code of Federal Regulations. The Code of Federal Regulations one can think of as sort of the Bible of the U.S. government. There are many different sections of the CFR that dictate how all branches of the government are to operate, not just FDA, but EPA and IRS and GAO and so on and so on and so on. Now, if you have ever read any sections of the Code of Federal Regulations, it's pretty boring. In fact, it's about as exciting as watching paint dry. And more importantly, it does not tell you in any specific detail what to do. In other words, it will often tell you that you need to do something, but it won't tell you how you need to do it. The next question to ask is, for the information that we do find in the Code of Federal Regulations, is it binding? In other words, must we do it? Well, most people would say, and the textbook answer would say, that yes, what you find in the CFR is binding. In other words, if it says that you need to do something in there, then you need to do it. However, reality is not necessarily so simple. The most succinct and most accurate question to virtually every question, I'm sorry, the most succinct and most accurate response to virtually every question in regulatory affairs, no matter what the question is it depends. So is the CFR binding? Yes, but dot dot dot. What do I mean by that? Simple. If something is in the CFR, then you likely will have to do it, but that does not mean that you necessarily have to do it. In other words, if I can make the case, and I've done this at FDA many times, where what is in the CFR it doesn't make sense in my particular situation for whatever reason, and I want to do something else, as long as I can present and sell a logical argument explaining my reasons, my justification, then I can argue my way right out of doing something that is listed in the CFR. However, and this is an important point, because the CFR is at a higher level of the guidance, and I'll talk more about that in a moment, I have to have a very strong, compelling, and most importantly, salable argument that I can pose to convince people that what is listed in the CFR is wrong, or at least in my case not appropriate, and what I want to do makes more sense. So the bar is set higher for the CFR than it is for the guidance. The next question is the information that we find in the guidance documents binding? Well, once again, most people would say, and the textbook answer would say, no, the information in the guidance is not binding. But I would say it's not quite so simple. In other words, no, but. If I want to do something different than what is in the guidance, or if I don't want to do something in the guidance at all, I can likely get away with not doing it or doing something differently, as long as I have a convincing, a strong, and saleable argument as to justify why I don't want to do what's in the guidance, or why I think that what is in the guidance doesn't make sense, at least in my particular case. But comparing what we find in the guidance to what we find in the CFR is at a higher level. So in other words, if I want to do something different than what's in the guidance, that's a relatively easy thing to do. If I want to do something different than what's shown in the CFR, that's still doable, but it's a little bit more challenging. I need to have a stronger argument in order to do that. Here's a bit of regulatory mumbo jumbo, and I very infrequently get into the regulatory mumbo jumbo. Here is one of the exceptions to that rule, and that is guidance documents do not create or confer any rights or on uh, for or on any person and do not operate to bind FDA or the public. In other words, as I've already described, simply put, according to the textbook anyway, what is in the guidance is not binding, what is in the CFR is, but again, it is not nearly so simple. Finally, where does the requirements in the guidance documents come from? Well, many people think that it comes from FDA. Once again, it's not nearly so simple. Basically, where it comes from is us, meaning industry. In other words, simply put, what FDA does is when they get submissions in a new area, they'll take a look at the first few submissions and they'll pick out what those manufacturers did that they liked, and they will put that information in the guidance, and that then will become the standard for the future. Oftentimes people from industry complain to me that they don't understand why something is in the guidance, or they don't think that something should be in the guidance, and they will often blame FDA. But as I remind them, since most of the information in the guidance comes from industry, either directly or indirectly, I like to think of the guidance as FDA's commentary on the CFR. I often say to companies, be careful what you put in your first submissions, because if FDA likes that, that could ultimately go into the guidance. In other words, does the information in the guidance come from the FDA? Not so much. It comes primarily from industry. One last point on this, and this is a very valuable regulatory strategy point, and that is we can often use as a barrier to entry, in other words, to set the bar higher, information that we put in a submission in a new area. If we're the first to market in a new area, in a new product technology, we can put as part of our submission a particular test that we did that might have been difficult or time consuming or expensive for us to do, but as long as we were going to do it anyway, why not try to use it to act as a barrier, as a competitor to, as a impediment to entry, in order to make it more difficult, more challenging for the second and the third and the fourth people coming through the door at FDA in the same product category. This is one of many examples where how we can use regulatory strategy to actually make it more difficult, more challenging for our competitors to get their products onto the market. This is a very important lesson to be learned. Here's an example guidance document. I'm not going to go into the details of it, but the viewer is highly encouraged to take a look at some guidance documents in detail and start to become familiar with how they're organized, how they're written, and most importantly, the kind of information that you find in there and the kind of information that you do not find in there. Like in everything, what is often more important than what we see is what we don't see and why we don't see it. Another interesting point about guidance documents is, did you ever notice that many, although certainly not all, have the word draft stamped on them? But what does draft mean? Well, interestingly enough, I like to think of I like to think that there is no such thing as a draft guidance document. Why? Because all guidance documents, whether they say draft or not, are all works in progress. This is a very important point. All guidance documents, whether they say draft or not, are all works in progress. People also sometimes use the term final guidance. Once again, there is really no such thing in reality. You can kind of think of a guidance document like a resume. A resume is always a work in progress. When does your resume become final? I suppose on the day that you die. All right. So guidance documents are very much the same. Whether they say draft or not, whether they say final or not, all guidance documents should be considered works in progress. Similarly, sort of like CGMPs, or current good manufacturing practices. I find it interesting that whoever added the little c in front of GMP was, quite frankly, an idiot for many reasons. And I'll just list a couple. First of all, why would anybody want to follow something that wasn't current? That's number one. We're as most of you know, we're updating these regulations periodically. In the case of the GMP, is usually every 2 years. So does that mean that 2 years from now we're going to be referring to them as the more current good manufacturing practices, and 2 years ago the less current good manufacturing practices, and so on and so on? Second reason, we don't use this C prefix in front of any other sets of regulations. In other words, we don't refer to CGCPs for good clinical trials, or CGLPs for good laboratory practices, and so on and so on. Only for good manufacturing practices. The question is why? Even though everybody does it and we've been doing it for a while, the question is, does it make sense? Bottom line, what is in the guidance is recommended, but it's not required. Remember, just because something is recommended doesn't necessarily mean you must do it. However, you do need to be prepared to explain why you're not doing it if it says that you should. And once again, if you don't want to do something in the CFR, that is setting the bar at a higher level. In other words, you need to have a stronger explanation than if you're not planning on doing something, or you're doing something differently than what's in the guidance. There are a number of databases freely available on FDA's website. Here's an example of their guidance document database. Once again, I encourage each of you to get into one of the guidance documents databases and poke around and see the kind of information that you can find in there. In addition to that, some databases are focused in a particular area. For example, this is the biologics guidance database. You could look at the medical device guidance database, and so on and so on. If I were going to go to the medical device guidance database and type in the word stent, here is a short list of the kinds of guidances that I might see. But once again, we have to look beyond what we see and consider what we don't see. So many people, if they don't find something in one of these databases, they assume that it does not exist. That's only one possibility. A second possibility is that it does exist, but they haven't put it into the database yet. A third possibility is that they're not searching for it properly. In other words, instead of the word stent, the authors of the guidance might be using a different word, and so on and so on. So we cannot conclude, and I see people do this all the time, we cannot conclude that just because somebody doesn't find something in a database means that it's not there. The world is not nearly as simple as that. So I hope this short overview has provided you with a bit of a better understanding of guidance documents and how they differ from the CFR, and most importantly, how we can use what we find in the guidance and in the CFR as part of our regulatory strategy. That is perhaps the most important lesson to be learned of all.